Howdy y'all, welcome to the Kentuckian. Today we're going to be talking about some of what I would consider the best or coolest or most influential Cold War tanks, kind of a combo of that. It'll be a little bit different from some of the other tank content, and I wanted to say real briefly, these videos, especially the tank videos, but the videos in general have been a great learning experience for me. I've really been able to hone my craft, to become more careful about things I need to be more careful about, to learn and grow, and this video is no different. I'm not quite as familiar with Cold War tanks. I am some, but this has been a great opportunity to dig in a little more, and I'm excited about it, so I hope that you all are as well. It should be a pretty short video, and I wanted to say as we jump into the tanks here, as we get to the meat of our content, don't forget to like and hit that subscribe button. Those things help with the visibility of my channel, and comment down below what you think. Also, maybe consider going over to the Rumble page and subscribing there. It looks like that I've been throttled on YouTube pretty heavily, so that hopefully will help my visibility on that platform. Anyway, let's get into the tanks. So the first tank I want to talk about, and we're going to talk about three today. The first one is the M60 main battle tank. Now this is an American tank. It might be considered the first modern MBT or main battle tank. There were some other tanks before it that were really its ancestors that sort of fit into the definition of an MBT, but the M60 really was a pretty modern incarnation of it. It was the last development in the family of Patton tanks, which would include the M46, the M47, and the M48 tanks. And you'll notice if you ever see a picture of an M48 and an M60, they look very similar. However, even though the M60 is colloquially known as the Patton, it was never officially designated as such. So it is an evolution of that family, and you can see when it's up next to the M48 especially, a lot of design similarities, but it isn't technically the M60 Patton. You'll hear it called that though. When I think of the M60, I almost think of like a modern incarnation of the Sherman. It was a good balance of most all of the important factors. That's not an exact analog, but I think it's a good way to think about it. It's a good way to think about the main battle tank concept in general. The MBT is kind of meant to be an all-purpose combat tank. It does focus, from what I've seen, a little bit more on the anti-tank warfare, but anyway, that's sort of the idea of the MBT, and tanks like the Sherman and the T-34, and to a certain degree the Panther from World War II, really influenced what would eventually become MBTs like the M60, or the other tanks that we'll talk about here in just a moment. The M60 had good mobility, and it had a good, although more armor-oriented gun. It was the M68 105mm gun. There were several different variants of the M60. Some of them had different cannon or a upgraded M68, the M68E1. There were some experimental versions of the M60, and then there were many variants that may have upgraded power plants or armor or sensor equipment, that sort of thing. Interesting thing about the M60, even though it is a more advanced tank than the M48, the front of the hull where the armor is was actually much simpler to allow the attachment of a more advanced composite applique armor. So it was they would actually attach these plates to the hull of the tank instead of the hull integrating armor into its production rolled steel. Now, the M60 still had rolled steel armor, but they could also add extra, more advanced armor. A weird element of studying Cold War armor and armored fighting vehicles is the combat or service record. The problem is a lot of times these tanks haven't seen much service. The M60 did see some. It was solid. It was some after the Cold War as well, like Operation Desert Storm, but the action that the M60 ever saw really was quite limited. When it did see action, it basically always performed well against its Russian counterparts, but as with anything, crew training and discipline and tactics are a huge factor in whether a tank like the M60 or the Russian tanks it would go up against would be effective. The M60 had a very long service life because it could be continually upgraded. It had room to accommodate newer equipment, more advanced equipment that would give it an edge. And it's actually still in use by many countries today with various upgrade and modernization packages. The United States even used it as late as '91 in the Operation Desert Storm, as I've already mentioned, and it performed very well there. Now we're going to move to really three Russian tanks, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. So the Russians have a number of tanks from the Cold War and modern era that seem very similar. Their design has stayed. When you look at going all the way back to a T-54 or T-55, which we're not really going to talk about, but some of the older main battle tanks of the Russians, all the way to the T-90s, which are the newest main battle tanks of the Russians, excluding the T-14. Again, we're talking more about that middle area. However, if you see pictures of all these tanks compared, there's a lot of similarities in design. So telling them apart visually is a lot harder than some tanks, although it is possible. And there's three in particular I want to talk about that really were very similar, and I'll explain why. So I want to talk about the T-62, the T-64, and the T-72. The T-64 I want to talk about first. We're actually not going to talk about it very long. It was an advanced MBT for the time. It used a lot of experimental or very young technologies that weren't the best implemented yet. They still needed refinement, and it was much more expensive and difficult to produce. It had a 125 millimeter gun, which was bigger than most of the guns that the West was using at the time, but it was theoretically a very advanced tank. It had a lot of logistical problems. It had a lot of kinks to work out because of how advanced it was, and it was never exported while the Soviet Union was alive, and it's it was a test bed in a lot of ways. It wasn't meant to be a test bed, but the lessons learned from the T-64 really affected one of the other tanks we'll talk about, and then further more modern Russian tanks afterwards. So I also want to talk about the T-62. Now, the T-62 was a counterpart to the T-64 it was less advanced. It was a simpler design than the T-64, but it was also cheaper and easier to produce and had less problems. And so it was a much more common tank. It was exported a lot. It had a 115 millimeter gun that was probably a little less powerful than the 125 millimeter, but it was a very good tank. The third tank was the T-72. The T-72 was in a sense, more advanced version of the T-64, but it took a lot of the lessons learned from the problems with the T-64 and fixed a lot of them. So the T-72 was almost a hybrid of the T-62 and T-64 from a design perspective. It took a lot of the pros from both and took some of the cons out from both, and it was a very effective tank as well. The T-62s and the T-72s were heavily upgraded and exported. As I mentioned, the T-64 wasn't exported, although it was upgraded. So anyway, the T-62 and the T-72 had a much longer service life than the T-64, which honestly is not really in use today. The T-62s and T-72s, however, are actually still in fairly heavy use today. Some cool features about the T-64 and the T-72, they had autoloaders. So basically that's just a machine that loads the ammunition into the tank gun. And what that allowed them to do was to reduce the crew of the tanks from 4, which was pretty traditional, to 3, allowing them to make the tank smaller, more compact, give it a lower profile, and make it lighter. And even the T-62 was small and light for what it was. And that was an interesting part about these Russian tanks. And you see this design trend even today. Most of their tanks are relatively small and very low profile. They're also very cramped, and they have some advantages. They tend to be lighter. They do have a low profile, which means you're less of a target, but they are cramped. It can reduce crew efficiency, crew survivability. There's a lot of disadvantages, but there's a lot of advantages to having a very small, low profile tank. A cool thing about, or an important pro of having a smaller tank, means you can put the same amount of armor, protection, equipment, whatever, on a smaller package, which means you can have it at a lighter weight. Having it at a lighter weight means you can generally, if you have a good power plant, get higher speed, and it can actually improve a tank's long-term efficiency. It can, I'm not saying it does all the time, but because it's a lighter vehicle, less strain is being put on the components, which means that theoretically it could last longer than heavier tanks with a similar capability. So, very interesting tanks. The T-62 and T-72 especially are in use today. They're heavily modified, and while they aren't the most advanced out there, they also still kind of hold their own. The more advanced versions of the T-72 are the T-80 and basically the T-90, if I understand correctly. And then the Russians have introduced an entirely new design recently called the T-14 Armata. But there's not really much known about that. It hasn't seen much action from my understanding. And supposedly not many of them have been produced either. There's a lot of stuff when it comes to, a lot of information when it comes to the Ukrainian-Russian war, when it comes to Russian arm development, that is just honestly unknown. There's a lot of propaganda out there on both sides, and there's a lot that just isn't known, unfortunately. And then I want to talk briefly about the last tank, which is the Leopard I. Now, the Leopard I was Germany's first proper main battle tank. It was a very well-engineered tank. It had a 105 millimeter L7 gun, or a license-built version of it. The L7 was a British gun that was very common in Western Allied tanks during the Cold War. It was a very good gun, and the Leopard I mounted a license-built version of it. The Leopard, more than the other tanks that we've talked about, had very light armor for an MBT. And all of the MBTs had relatively light armor. The reason for that being the anti-armor capabilities with heat rounds, HEAT rounds, and handheld rocket launchers like RPGs and anti-tank guided missiles like ATGMs. A lot of technological advances made heavy armor virtually useless. So a lot of these tanks had relatively light armor, at least in parts. The Leopard had very light armor all around. It could only reliably stop small arms and low-power autocannons. However, this was used as an advantage because the Leopard was exceptionally fast and exceptionally mobile. It was a heavily exported tank, although it wasn't produced in the numbers that the M60 or the Russian tanks were, but it was actually, a lot of countries used it. A few countries still use it today. And as with all of these tanks, it was heavily modified and upgraded for many years to give it a long service life and integrate in new technology and that sort of thing. So a very cool tank, very good tank in a lot of ways. Most of these tanks have been replaced. The M60 has been totally replaced by the U.S. military by the M1 Abrams and variants of it. The Leopard I has been replaced in Germany by the Leopard II, a much more advanced version of the Leopard I. And the Russians being kind of the exception because their tanks were so heavily produced and so prolific that they're still used today, including in Ukraine fairly heavily. This is not a complete list. It's just informative, kind of give you some general knowledge about these tanks. I think they're some of the coolest, but also most influential vehicles from the early to mid Cold War. So I hope that you found this episode interesting. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that like I mentioned. And don't forget the various social media pages, that sort of thing that we have, be linked down in the description below. And if you'd like to support the Kentuckian in a more personal way, my Patreon, is also linked in the description below. And remember, friends, as long as you and I are doing what's right, make a real difference in this old world. It's been Ryan Dalton of the Kentuckian, signing off.